The Christmas Cheese. Written by L.A. McGarvey. Produced by Trouble Twins Publishing. This audiobook has been produced using AI voice technology. Windfurlough. The town of Windfurlough glowed in the night like a Christmas lantern. Every sharp-front was dusted with snow, and strings of white lights crisscrossed the cobbled square, casting a golden glow that made the whole town look like it had stepped out of a snow globe. Fresh pine garlands tied with big red bows hung on every lamppost, and the smell of mulled cider and spiced cookies drifted from the baker's stall. In the center of it all, rising like a gnarled old wizard, stood Windfurlough's pride and joy, the ancient windmill. The windmill had been around so long, it was now part of the growing town of Windfurlough. Quaint streets surrounded the old stone building. The windmill was the focus of the upcoming Windfurlough Christmas Cheese Festival. The final judging of the region's best cheese would take place tomorrow, Christmas Day, in the cobblestone square in front of the windmill. Down in the windmill's stone cellar, nestled in a place of honor on a solid oak pedestal above the rest of the cheeses waiting to be set out in the morning, sat the grand block of mistlebreeze, a cheese of mythic proportions. This wasn't just any cheese. It was creamy, with a hint of earthy, piney sharpness, and a texture so smooth that the townsfolk claimed it could put an angel to sleep with just one bite. Upstairs, old Tobin, the windmill keeper and protector of the festival's cheesy contestants, stroked his long white beard as he looked out the window with a squint. "Just a few more hours till the grand tasting, Gertie," he muttered to his right. At his side the enormous goose shifted, her beady eyes staring into the shadows as if expecting a fight at any moment. Her webbed feet flexed on the wooden floor, and her beak was half open, ready to let loose one of her war cries at the first hint of danger. "That's right, Gertie," Tobin continued, his voice low. "You and me will keep the mistlebreeze and all the cheese safe. 50 years that cheese has been aging in the Mistlebreeze Estate cheese cave. No low-life thief is going to lay a single grubby finger on it. And no one will dare to sabotage the Windfurlough Cheese Festival. It's a sacred tradition." Gertrude let out a low, guttural honk, which Tobin took as an agreement. With a chuckle, he patted her. "You're the fiercest guard in all of Windfurlough, Gertrude. No one would dare try it." Little did old Tobin know that someone would dare. And that someone was Figgins McClurk, cheese enthusiast and questionable planner. Figgins McClurk. Figgins McClurk stood across the square in the dark shadows behind the festive bunting, bundled up in a wool coat and a scarf that kept his face mostly hidden. He was shivering, but Figgins wasn't just cold. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He'd heard rumors about the grand block of mistlebreeze for years, each tale making his mouth water more than the last. A rare, creamy, sharp but sweet cheese with notes of mystery and delight, aged 50 years, stored in an ancient windmill, worth a fortune to the right buyer, he whispered to himself, practically tasting it on his tongue. He shivered again, and it had nothing to do with the cold. "Right then, old boy," he muttered, patting his coat pocket where he'd stashed his secret weapon, a few cans of soda he'd been shaking on and off all evening. "Bit of fizz, a quick grab, and the cheese'll be as good as mine." He squinted at the windmill. It looked like something out of a bedtime story, standing tall and just a little crooked against the moonlit sky. And there, in the faint glow of the windmill window, he could just make out a shadow, old Tobin, muttering to himself like usual, probably talking to that blasted pet goose he kept. He stifled a chuckle. "A goose? Really? Nothing but feathers and fluff," he murmured to himself, checking his coat pocket one more time. The cans of soda rattled ominously as they clanked together. "Easy, Figgins. You've got this. It's just a little stroll in, grab the cheese and stroll out." He took a steadying breath, even as his heart hammered in his chest. With one last look around the empty square, lopsided, he slinked across the cobblestones, slipping like a shadow into the back door of the windmill. Gertrude. Figgins eased the door latch closed. He almost laughed at how easy this was going to be. He'd gotten his lockpicking tools out only to discover, to his delight, that the door latch was a simple wooden latch with a string. Old Man Tobin must be losing it, he thought. He'd left the string out. Anyone could have just waltzed into the old windmill. Figgins chuckled. Lucky that anyone was himself. Now all he had to do was find the door to the cellar, grab the cheese and get out. Inside the windmill the air was thick and musty, layered with the scents of straw, mulling cider and aged wood. He looked around. He was in some kind of mudroom. A pair of winter boots sat on a tray to collect water and mud, and several coats, sweaters and scarves hung above. Mittens on strings hung from a peg beside the door. There was a small nightlight on in the main room, and gave Figgins plenty of light to get around. He crept across the floor, carefully testing each board as he went, and was soon at the entrance to the windmill's kitchen. Leaving the muffled confines of the mudroom behind, he sidled around the small kitchen counter, keeping an eye out for the old goose. He had a hand wrapped around a can of soda, and drew it out of his pocket, shaking it as he went. In the dim light, he soon spotted a door. There was an open archway that obviously led to the main living area, so he focused on the door. It was either a closet, a pantry, or the door to the cellar, and led to the riches under the windmill. Silently, he lifted the latch. Figgins held his breath as he eased the door open, but he needn't have worried. The door swung open on well-oiled and silent hinges. He peeked down. There was a warm glow coming from below. Figgins grinned. Old Tobin had left a comforting light on for the cheese. How thoughtful. This was beginning to look like the easiest job he'd ever pulled. Figgins crept down the creaky staircase, his breath a cloud in the chilly air. He could see the grand block of Mistle Breeze, surrounded by all the other cheese in town for the Christmas festival, in the dim light, from a single flickering candle on a table in the center of the cellar. "There she is," he whispered, his eyes gleaming. The block was glorious, a creamy yellow tinged with golden specks, a cheese of sheer majesty that seemed to glow as if lit from within. Figgins felt his mouth water. "Come to Papa." He crept across the floor, careful not to touch anything. He put the soda can in his pocket to leave his hands free, and pulled a bag from under his coat and gently shook it out. Frowning, he looked at the bag and then the cheese. He was going to need a bigger bag. Sighing, he folded up the bag in his hand and groped around in his coat for another. Finally, after taking his coat off to search, he found one that the Mistle Breeze cheese would fit into without damage. He stuck the bag in his teeth, while he wrestled back into his heavy coat. "Okay, my little darling. Why don't you come with me and make me a rich man?" Figgins reached for the Mistle Breeze cheese. "Hold it right there. Step away from the cheese." Figgins froze just as his fingers touched the cheese rind. "Turn around. I want to see the face of the miscreant who would dare to ruin the Christmas festival." Figgins turned around. "Figgins McClurk. I should have known." Old Man Tobin glared at him. "Only you are foolish enough to try something like this." Figgins said nothing. Old Tobin looked away at something behind him, and Figgins saw his chance. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the cold metal of a can. "All right, Tobin," he whispered. "Hope you're thirsty." "What?" Old Tobin said, spinning back to face him. But just as Figgins aimed, a loud honk tore through the silence. He froze, heart pounding. The next moment, a shadow loomed behind Tobin. From the darkness, he could see Gertrude's furious eyes gleaming like two sinister Christmas lights rushing straight for him. Now, let's not get hasty." But the goose had no intention of polite conversation. She let out another war cry and lunged, wings flapping like sails in a storm. Figgins stumbled back, fumbling with the soda can. He fumbled with the tab, intending to aim it right at her, but in his panic he turned it the wrong way. Honk! Gertrude swooped in with beak snapping, ready to slice through his coat. Figgins squeezed the can, intending to unleash a torrent of fizz at the attacking monster, but all he managed was to spray himself in the face. He yelped and gurgled, his vision blurry, and staggered blindly toward the pedestal. "Get him, Gertie!" Old Tobin yelled, cheering the maniac goose on. "Get off me, you feathered menace," he gasped, wiping soda from his eyes, but Gertrude was relentless as she whacked him with her wings. She pecked and hissed, honking with every strike, driving him into the corner like a boxer going for the final blow. Santa Claus. Outside, a cloud of snow kicked up as a sleigh pulled by 8 reindeer descended into the square. He landed on each rooftop in turn, until the only stop left in Windfurlough was the old windmill. Santa smiled. Milk and cookies were all well and good, but old Tobin always left out a prime selection of cheese and hot mulled cider. He had saved the best for last. The windmill was his last delivery for the year, and he was looking forward to it. The reindeer jumped off the roof of the orphanage and flew across town to the village square. It was a tricky business landing on the windmill, but Santa expertly guided his team to the flat ledge old Tobin had built there many years ago. The reindeer sighed with pleasure as the sleigh touched down. They knew this was their last stop before going home to the North Pole, for a well-deserved candy cane mash and rest. Santa Claus, dressed in his red suit with its black patent leather belt and matching boots gleaming like polished coal, climbed out of his sleigh. He tossed the sack of presents over his shoulder, and in the wink of an eye descended the chimney into the windmill to deliver his gifts to old Tobin and Gertrude. He emerged from the hearth to stand in the windmill's cozy living room. There, on a table beside the Christmas tree, was the crock-pot full of mulled cider and the expected plate of cheese and crackers. Santa smacked his lips and rubbed his hands in anticipation. But first, before he could enjoy his snack, he needed to finish his job. Opening the sack, he removed a handful of small packages. He put these in Gertrude's stocking. Next, he filled Tobin's stocking. He was just about to reach in and pull out the last gift when he heard a ruckus coming from the cellar beneath his feet. Santa paused and cocked his head. There it was again. It sounded like the angry honks of a goose followed by a scream. "What in the candy cane blazes?" he muttered. He dropped his sack, gifts forgotten, and followed the noise through the living room into the kitchen and to an open door. He went to the door and peered down. The noises were definitely coming from the cellar. Not stopping to think about what he might find, Santa dashed down the stairs. "I think we've got ourselves a situation," Santa said as he stared at the scene that greeted his eyes at the foot of the steps. Figgins McClurk was cornered, pinned against the wall by Gertrude's sharp beak, beating wings and honking wrath. He held his hands up, half in surrender, half in desperation. "Call her off, will you?" he pleaded, glancing at Tobin, who was grinning with amusement and encouraging the goose. "Gertrude," Tobin called, clapping his hands. The goose backed off slightly, her feathers still fluffed in anger, her head darting back and forth as she kept her eyes firmly on the would-be thief. Gertrude hissed, and Figgins cringed back with a cry of terror. Santa couldn't stand idly by. He had just given Figgins McClurk a lump of coal in his stocking for his naughty behavior all year, but he couldn't simply watch him being attacked by an angry goose on Christmas Eve. "Ho ho ho!" Santa boomed and stepped into the windmill cellar, his boots crunching on the floor. "Now what's all this noise? It sounded like a sleigh crash in here." Figgins's face went pale. "Oh no, the big man himself." "Hello, Chris." Gertrude was just putting an end to McClurk's shenanigans. He was trying to steal the Misselbreeze cheese before tomorrow's festival. Old Tobin said. Santa crossed his arms and gave Figgins a look so stern it could have curdled milk. "Trying to make off with the town's prized Christmas cheese, are we?" Figgins gulped, his gaze darting between Santa and the goose, who was still watching him like a hawk. Well, technically yes." Santa shook his head, his beard twitching as he fought back a grin. "Oh, I've seen it all but a cheese thief on Christmas Eve. That's a new one." Figgins tried to shrug, which was hard to do when covered in goose scratches and drenched in sticky soda. "Look, Santa, it was just a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? That goose understood just fine, Santa replied with a wink at Gertrude. Gertrude honked approvingly, her feathers settling down a bit. Now, Santa continued, his eyes twinkling with mischief, what do you think we ought to do with you? Figgins opened his mouth but no words came out. He looked around the room, realizing he was entirely out of options. Anything but the goose, he finally stammered, looking at Gertrude with pleading eyes. Please, Santa, not the goose. I think Gertrude should put an end to him once and for all, old Tobin harumphed. Gertrude hissed and flapped her wings at Figgins in agreement. Figgins screamed and pressed himself farther into the corner. I'm sorry, Figgins shouted. Now, Tobin, where's your Christmas spirit? Why are you trying to steal the cheese, Figgins? Santa asked. Figgins, tears rolling down his cheeks, said, I need the money. I can't get a job and now, the bank is going to foreclose on my house. I was promised enough money for the Misselbreeze cheese, that I can move away and start a new life. I haven't been able to get a new job since Old Man Fryer fired me from the diner, so he could hire his nephew. I've been blackballed in town. Santa said as he tapped his moustache thoughtfully. I heard you got fired for stealing from the tip jar, Tobin said. Figgins shook his head. It wasn't me, I swear. It was Fryer's nephew and he blamed me. Santa cocked his head. This was news to him. He could see that he would have to have a word with the elves about thoroughly checking their information before adding someone to the naughty list, from now on. Maybe he needed to start checking his list more than twice. He felt bad about leaving the lump of coal in Figgins' stocking, but on the other hand, Figgins was here now, attempting to steal, so he must be punished. You will need to be punished for this, Figgins, Santa told him. I know, Figgins said and hung his head. Santa's judgment. Figgins held his breath, waiting for Santa's judgment, his eyes barely daring to leave Gertrude. The goose's eyes gleamed with fresh excitement, as though she were planning another round of attack. Santa stroked his beard thoughtfully. Well now, stealing on Christmas Eve? That's a serious offense. Especially when it's cheese theft. I'm sure you know there's nothing more sacred than Christmas, and cheese. Figgins' shoulders slumped. You're right. Figgins McClurk am the world's worst Christmas cheese thief. He sighed dramatically. You know what? Just throw me in the village jail, Santa. Lock me up with the gingerbread crumbs and leftover candy canes. But Santa shook his head. No jail time for you, Figgins. The thief blinked, caught off guard. What, no jail? Not even a light scolding? What? You can't seriously think of letting him go scot-free, just because it's Christmas? Old Tobin asked. Even Gertrude looked at Santa and honked in surprise. Oh, Figgins will serve justice, believe me. Santa's eyes sparkled as he pointed a mittened finger toward the cheese. Your punishment is that you're going to help serve the grand block of Misselbreeze at the festival's grand tasting. Figgins gasped. The tasting? Me? In public? Santa nodded, his tone turning grave. Yes, Figgins. Not only will you serve it, but you'll personally deliver each slice to the festival goers, and tell them exactly what you tried to do here tonight. A ripple of panic swept through Figgins. You mean? I have to explain I tried to steal it. That will only make Old Man Fryer's accusations seem real. Santa's laugh was warm, filling the room with the scent of peppermint and pine. Yes. I considered that. You will also explain that because of Old Man Fryer's actions, you were forced into thievery. I will take care of Old Man Fryer, don't you worry. He will not naysay you tomorrow. Things will all work out in the end. Santa promised. Oh. One more thing. What's that? Figgins asked. You will serve the cheese, but you will not have any of it. Not even a crumb. Do I make myself clear? Figgins slumped, looking longingly at the golden velvety block of cheese, which had never looked so beautiful or so unattainable. Fine, he mumbled. I'll do it. But I'm telling you, this is practically cruel and unusual punishment. Santa raised his eyebrows, a knowing smile on his lips. Stealing cheese is quite unusual too, wouldn't you agree? From his post near the Misselbreeze cheese, Tobin grinned, a mischievous light in his eyes. I think it's perfect, Santa. Figgins rolled his eyes, muttering, Merry Christmas to me. Christmas redemption. The next morning, the square was buzzing with excitement. News had spread fast. Everyone had heard about Figgins's attempted cheese theft, which by now had taken on a life of its own. Townsfolk bustled around, whispering stories with exaggerated gestures and laughing over mugs of spiced cider. In the center of it all stood a long table draped in red and green, and right in the middle of the table sat the grand block of Misselbreeze. Tobin had even put a tiny Santa hat on top, adding an extra festive touch. Gertrude paced the length of the table, eyeing Figgins as he shuffled back and forth, carrying slices of cheese to the waiting line of festival-goers. Here you go, he muttered, handing a plate to Mrs. Thimbleby, a spry old lady who had gone overboard in her excitement for the festival and baked half the treats in the village. She grinned as she took her slice, winking at him. Thank you, dear. So you tried to steal it, did you? Her eyes sparkled with delight, as though Christmas had come early. Figgins groaned. Yes, Mrs. Thimbleby. I tried to steal the cheese. But only because Old Man Fryer fired me to give his nephew a job after he stole the money from the tip jar. She chuckled, taking a hearty bite. Well, bless you, lad. That goose gave you what for, didn't she? More than what for, I'd say, Figgins muttered, rubbing a bruise on his leg from a nasty pinch Gertrude had given him. He reached for another plate of cheese, but his gaze kept drifting longingly to the slices as they left his hands. He'd been forbidden from tasting even a crumb. He sighed. Mrs. Thimbleby patted his arm. Don't worry, dear. I hear that Old Man Fryer got nothing at all from Santa for Christmas this year, and his thieving nephew ran off with all the money from his safe. Really? Figgins asked, blinking at the news. I hadn't heard that. Hot off the press, as they say. She looked at him thoughtfully. You know, I thought it odd how things went down. I knew deep in my heart that you aren't really the kind of young man to steal the tips. I mean, Gertrude bested you. Hardly the kind of thing to happen to a hardened criminal now, is it? Figgins chuckled. No. I guess not. Thank you. Mrs. Thimbleby patted his arm again. You come see me on Monday. I need someone to clean my attic and fix a few things around the house now that Mr. Thimbleby's not around anymore. I know a few others that need some help too. Thank you, Mrs. Thimbleby. I will be there first thing Monday morning. Figgins exclaimed, and as a thank you, gave the old widow another slice of the Misselbreeze cheese. She went on her way with a smile and a cheerful wave. Oi, Figgins, called Percy, the town's butcher, stepping up to the table with a grin. Heard you got yourself in a bit of a flap last night. He nodded toward Gertrude. And that feathered monster did you in, eh? Figgins forced a smile. Yes, Percy. That's the gist of it. Oh, don't be such a sour sport, Figgins. Percy took a massive bite of cheese and sighed blissfully. Now this is Christmas on a plate. Percy licked his fingers as he closed his eyes to savor the last bit of cheese. I think this cheese could settle any argument. Sweet, sharp, smooth, it's just perfect. Figgins nearly whimpered. He tried to look away, but his eyes kept snapping back to the cheese, to the expressions of rapture on everyone's faces. It was unbearable. He handed another plate to a passing child, who stuffed a whole wedge in his mouth and beamed. And then, from the corner of his eye, Figgins saw Santa strolling over, his red suit bright against the wintry backdrop. The old man looked thoroughly pleased with himself as he stopped beside Figgins, hands folded behind his back. Enjoying yourself? Santa asked, his voice full of mirth. Figgins gave a sour chuckle. "Oh, absolutely, Santa. Loving every minute. Mrs. Thimbleby offered me a job." He glanced sidelong at Santa. "And she told me that Old Man Friar's nephew cleaned him out and ran off in the night. I told you things would work out." Santa chuckled, nodding toward the cheese. "You know, Figgins, there's a lesson here." Figgins sighed, resigned. "Let me guess, something about sharing. Or about not trying to snatch the cheese from everyone's Christmas." He forced a laugh, only for it to turn into a cough, when Gertrude gave him a suspicious glare and a warning hiss. "Well, that too," Santa said with a wink, "but more than anything, it's a reminder that sometimes the best things in life are better when enjoyed together." With that, Santa handed him a small, perfectly cut slice of mistlebreeze. Figgins's eyes widened, his heart racing. "Really? For me?" Santa nodded. "Consider it a Christmas gift." Figgins held the slice gingerly, hardly daring to believe it. He took a slow, reverent bite, his eyes closing as the flavors unfolded, sharp, sweet and creamy, just as he'd imagined. Christmas on a plate, just as Percy had said. When he opened his eyes, he caught Santa watching him with a knowing smile. Figgins laughed softly, the tension melting from his shoulders. "You know, Santa, maybe you were right. Maybe it's best when it's shared." Santa clapped him on the back. "Now that's the Christmas spirit, Figgins." Epilogue. By the following year, Figgins McClurk was known not just as Windfurlough's infamous cheese thief, but as the town's most festive cheese connoisseur. With Mrs. Thimbleby's encouragement, he became a regular volunteer on the Grand Cheese Tasting Committee, serving slices with a flourish and telling stories of his fateful encounter with Gertrude, who was now a town legend in her own right. As for Gertrude, she patrolled the windmill with even greater ferocity, proudly keeping her beady eyes on the cheeses stored in the cellar, and Figgins made sure to bring her the finest shredded cabbage as a peace offering every Christmas Eve. And every year on Christmas Eve, Figgins would glance up, always catching a twinkle in the night sky, as if Santa himself were looking down on Windfurlough. Figgins waved at the starry sky, and he looked to imagine Santa waved back. Because sometimes Christmas miracles came with a honk, a slice of cheese, and a rare second chance for a repentant